Are they starters or are they relievers? That is the question I asked myself as I was putting together my top 40 pitching prospects, which will eventually come out on my Substack. Jacob Misiorowski and Hurston Waldrep were two names with some of the loudest stuff, the most interesting arms perhaps, inside that top 15 or so. But I'm not totally convinced either of them are going to throw enough strikes to be starting pitchers. So that is the main question, right? Starter or reliever, and how does it affect the rank? In this video, we're going to dig into the advanced data, the shape data behind both of these arms, try to come to some conclusion. Let's get going first with Jacob Misiorowski. This guy mechanically is an absolute freak. He stands 6'7" on the mound. His extension is around 7.5 feet, which would be tied for third in MLB, right around guys like Alexis Diaz, Devin Williams, and Logan Gilbert. And his release height is all the way down at just 5 feet on his fastball, which is nearly 10 inches below the major league average release height. It's just such a funky look for hitters from a body movement and release perspective. Mechanically, he has a pretty distinct scap retraction in his motion. Not a lot of pitchers get their arm retracted that far back in relation to their torso as they load, accelerate, and unwind on their way to the mound. Or maybe they do, and the Miz, as he's called, his arms are just so long it stands out visually when you watch him. He throws a fastball that averaged 97 miles per hour last year, a pretty gyro-y cutter around 90 miles per hour, and he's got a big slurvy slider curveball. And in the data I have, there's also a separately used changeup that's like 91 miles per hour or so, but it was only thrown about 20 or 30 times over almost 1,000 pitches, so we're not going to really talk about that pitch too much. His fastball is funky because it borders on what you'd call dead zone territory. Dead zone fastballs are those with near equal parts vertical and horizontal movement. Misiorowski's had about 14 inches of vertical movement and 12 inches of arm side movement last year, so it's more of a runner fastball than one with pure carry. If you look at a stuff plus plot like this one for fastballs between 90 to 95 miles per hour, that bluish area is the dead zone. It's pitches that historically don't grade out well based on their movement. The thing is, pitchers who throw hard have a much smaller dead zone. Greater velocity buys you more room for your fastball to have average or so movement and still be a good pitch. So if you compare that 90 to 95 stuff chart to one that's say 96 to 98, which is generally where Misiorowski sits, you can see the blue dead zone here kind of shrinks. Prior to July 1st last season, his fastball generated a 37% swing miss rate, just blowing it by lower level competition. And then after July 1st, as he got promoted, the swing miss on the pitch came down a bit, but it was still pretty solid at 25%. The average swing miss for a four-seam fastball in the majors is something like 22%. From a contact quality standpoint, the fastball was more of a fly ball pitch, but the net xwOBA was pretty strong on the offering. Again, a small decline as he jumped up to face better competition. The slider cutter thing he throws might actually be my favorite pitch of his. I say slider cutter because early in the season, the movement profile was more slider. It had 3 inches of vertical movement, 4 inches of horizontal movement at 89, and it carved up lower level hitters, generating a near 50% swing miss. And then as he jumped levels, the pitch got harder. It averaged like 90 to 91, while the rest of his repertoire from a velocity standpoint actually took a slight step back, about 1 mile per hour across the board. And as a result of that tight slider of his getting harder, it became more of a cutter up at 91 or so, and it had more like 6 to 7 vertical with just 1 to 2 horizontal. And it still performed pretty well from a contact quality standpoint. Then we have this huge breaking ball he throws. The data I have has it tracked as a slider, but the movement of the pitch to me is actually a true slurve, or you could even call it a curveball. It's anywhere from 83 to 85 with -7 inches of induced vertical and 13 inches of sweep. I think it's a slurve or a curve because the amount of downward break it has, that -7 of induced vertical, is pretty dramatic for a typical slider. It's just a massive pitch, generates a pretty crazy amount of swing miss, but the chase on it isn't really that great, partially because some of his misses are just kind of way out of the zone, non-competitive. When the pitch is in the zone, however, good luck. Nobody at any level is really hitting a pitch up at 85 miles per hour with 20 inches of total movement. But now to the main knock on The Miz, he just doesn't throw enough strikes. He did strike out 34% of the batters he faced at AA in 5 starts, but he had a 15% walk rate, almost 7 walks per 9 innings. And his strike rates aren't that great on really any of his pitches. Even a pitcher at the major league level who is more walk prone, like a Dylan Cease or Blake Snell, still usually has 2 pitches getting somewhere around 60% or greater strikes. Miz doesn't really have that on any of his pitches. His fastball's kind of close, What's interesting to me is that when the slider cutter thing of his changed to that harder version with more backspin in the second half, the strike rate fell about 7 to 8%, as he was probably trying to get a feel for a different version of the pitch. So he lost his ability to kind of strike that offering, which is in his repertoire to get strikes. To me, finding this pitch for strikes is really the key. If he could get both that pitch and his fastball into the mid 60% in terms of strike rate, which would be around the major league average, even slightly below, it doesn't really matter if that bigger slurve curve thing is out of the zone a ton, because he's trying to elicit chase on it in deep counts regardless. And anything else he develops in his repertoire won't really need the pressure of being an above average strike pitch. What I will be watching for going forward is whether the Miz can have two pitches that he can get in zone around a league average rate or even below. It'll probably be the fastball, it'll probably be the tight slider cutter thing. The Brewers have an okay track record with getting guys like this into the zone as well, which makes me slightly bullish that maybe over time they actually will be able to corral him. They got Burns in the zone, although they did that with an individual pitch in his cutter. But Freddie Peralta is another really good example. He has huge extension like the Miz, and he was able to kind of corral it over time. This repertoire for the Miz is not fully complete, right? He's only 22. It takes time for these guys to kind of maybe corral their mechanics, get them in zone, which is potentially another thing positive in his direction from an upside standpoint. There's maybe room for a true sweeper, or there's maybe room for more changeup splitter development. I like him as a whole. We just have probably a longer runway before he gets to the majors and actually throws enough strikes to be considered a true starting pitcher. Hurston Waldrep of the Braves is next, and he has a pretty different look to him than Misiorowski. Waldrep is only 6'2", but he has a release that's over a foot higher than Misiorowski. Waldrop's release height is around 6.2 to 6.3 feet, which is higher than the major league average by about 5 inches. He's a pretty over-the-top guy with solid extension, and because of that, his profile is much more north-south than Misiorowski. He has a fastball, slider, and splitter, the split being the pitch that is the most fun in his mix. But we'll start with his fastball, which is a pitch that he cuts a lot. The average four-seam fastball in the majors has about 8 inches of arm side movement, depending on the arm slot. Waldrop's has 0 inches of that arm side movement with 14 inches vertical break, and he averaged 96 miles per hour. Like Misiorowski, you can argue that this movement is suboptimal. Waldrep is really cutting his fastball, but he's throwing it 96, so again, he's buying himself some room to have okay movement and for the pitch to still grade out as above average. The shape of Waldrop's fastball is comparable to Tyler Glasnow, Drew Rasmussen, who also cut their fastballs a lot. Waldrep is just not getting nearly the same amount of vertical break or carry as he cuts the pitch, which would in fact help the grade go even higher. So you kind of have to relinquish him and say it's more maybe like a Spencer Turnbull four-seam fastball than it is like Glasnow or Rasmussen. His splitter is what ESPN's Kylie McDaniel calls a snowflake for how unique the movement is pitch to pitch. I've talked about this particular splitter in other videos because it's so funky, but he throws what you'd call more of a gyro splitter. That just means the ball spins more like a bullet out of his hand and has less arm side movement. You could kind of see it rotating around itself on the way to the plate here, as opposed to one that spins more like a disco ball or disco spin. The average splitter has around 10 inches of arm side movement from a right-handed hitter in the majors. Waldrop's has about half of that, only 5 inches of arm side movement at about 87 to 89 miles per hour. So you're noticing a slight trend here with these two pitches. The fastball and splitter he throws both have less arm side movement than most other MLB average pitches for those pitch types. His slider is a tight gyro pitch at 86 to 87, and the thing that jumps out about it to me is how close it is to his splitter in terms of movement at times. You could see it on a pitch plot like this one. He didn't throw a ton of pitches at AAA, so we're working with a small sample, but the tagging system for pitch types had some issues discerning what was what. There's a lot of overlap in color, whereas most pitch plots are pretty separated between offerings. That inconsistency of his shapes, or what Kylie McDaniel calls the snowflake tendency on the splitter, I think applies to his slider as well. At times it dropped down to like 85 miles per hour and had a bit more depth. Other times it got up to 89 and held shape, was a bit tighter. There's just a bit of inconsistency in what he throws. Could be a byproduct of adjusting to different baseballs, but we usually think of that inconsistency in shape as not great. But as you could see in the results for these two non-fastball Waldrep pitches, they absolutely dominated. Each held a greater than 40% swing miss. The chase numbers were right around MLB average for each pitch type, and each was really hard to kind of put any barrel on with a sub 300 xWOBA and slug. and a small sample of balls in play for either offering. The problem with Waldrep, again, is that I'm not totally sure he's a starting pitcher. And I say that for a slightly different reason than Misiorowski, who just had pretty poor strike rates. Waldrep actually kind of has passable strike rates. His splitter is out of the zone a ton, so the strike rate there is never going to be good, but applying our idea of do you have two pitches that can get strikes at a league average rate to Waldrep, he actually passes. So it's a bit odd to me that he had a 13% walk rate in the 30 innings or so that he threw in the minors this season. I think it could relate to what we see in his shapes. He's just a bit more inconsistent. Start to start, the range of outcomes in his command just fluctuates a lot. And this lines up with his start to start game log as well. Just the simple eye test shows that he has starts where he's walking nobody and others where he's walking 3+. Misiorowski is just consistently walking multiple guys per outing. Now, I tend not to get into mechanics too much on my channel because there's just not a lot of public objective info to back up what we're seeing visually, but I did have a non-Braves MLB analyst send me a screen grab of Waldrep at foot strike and say not great. And I think what he was getting at is that there's potentially some out of plane rotation between his shoulder line and his arm. There's a lot of extreme trunk tilt here. It's just kind of a funky look in terms of how he gets to be over the top so much. Now, make of this what you will. It's not an end-all be-all. This is his first year in the Braves organization. Perhaps they changed some things, but it's something to consider and potentially links to the fact that he's relatively inconsistent. Now, you could get similar reactions, I think, to Misiorowski's mechanics, given how odd his arm path is and that scap retraction, kind of how he moves. But the difference between the two is that Waldrep's actually getting more strikes, even if the stuff might not be as loud and even if the mechanics are perhaps a bit wackier. So that's what I have on these two guys. I think my lean right now is to go Misiorowski over Hurston Waldrep. And it stems from the fact that I do think that if Misiorowski can get generally in the zone a bit more, he's just a bit more of a freak in terms of what he's going to be able to display to hitters. I think there's more variability in what he can throw. He has a better ability to spin the ball, odd shapes. Waldrep to me tracks maybe more as a top-end closer because of the fastball and the split. I'd love to see him as a starter, and he is right now throwing a bit more strikes. We haven't had him in the Braves organization a ton, so it's a close one. I see the argument in either direction. I just think maybe Hurston Waldrep's range of outcomes is a little tighter, whereas Misiorowski's I think is really wide. There's a chance we look back in a couple years and see Misiorowski as one of the top pitchers in all of baseball. But again, super young on him in particular compared to Waldrep, which again maybe opens up the fact that there is possibly more upside there. So let me know in the comments what you think between these two guys. 3 years from now, we look back, who is the better pitcher, Hurston Waldrep or Jacob Misiorowski? As always, thank you for watching.